So when I was a teenager, I had my world rocked pretty good by a close loved one who attempted suicide. It was a real miracle. This person even survived. And a couple years later, they decided to move away, and I probably wouldn't see them again for a long time. But there's a movie that had just come out and seemed like it was going to be fascinating based on the previews. Of course, unlike movies today, the previews didn't give away quite as much, so I had no idea that this movie involved suicide as one of the central mechanisms of the plot. That movie was What Dreams May Come, starring Robin Williams and some other fine actors. And it portrayed this heaven where anything is possible. You know, how you appear, where you are, what you do, you know, the people with whom you connect. There's just infinite possibilities in this profoundly creative space of imagination and joy and, I guess, buoyancy and immense creativity of the human spirit. When Robin Williams' loved one became so saddened that he and their children had passed, she took her own life. She went to another realm in this afterlife, one where she was in bondage and a very dark place, pretty much stuck just with her misery, but without herself. And in order to free her from this, the main character, Robin Williams, decided that he was going to sacrifice this wonderful life where he could be with his children, he could be with everybody else in this internal kingdom, you know, to go into this place that he might not ever return from. And he chose to do it out of love, and he could only have guidance for part of the way, because along the way he also found all these countless souls that were caught in various hells and purgatories that seemed to reflect certain awful human experiences, like, you know, having your face walked all over, and finally to the place of sad emptiness and forgetting and eternal isolation. On a very happy note to begin with. But what I think is good to point out is the name of this movie, What Dreams May Come, kind of intersects with our work in depth therapy, especially the type of depth analysis that involves work with dreams, with ego states, and the types of dissociative relationships within that are especially tied to trauma. So I'd like to use this and maybe even a piece of the last season of Stranger Things. What these films can do is illustrate real processes that operate in our experience, in the human life, at the level of dreams. So, you know, what are dreams? You know, I was in a conversation with someone last night that had a philosophy of mind background, you know, thinking, you know, isn't this just the leftover garbage? Or I had a neuropsychology professor that once said that trying to understand anything about the psyche through the dreams is like trying to, you know, do a test on an engine by measuring the car exhaust, which I don't know if that's possible or not, but I disagree strongly. And this conversation may be a little too short to get into why, but I will say now I have very interesting mechanisms to discuss when it comes to the relationship of dreams and who we are as people that are backed up by the case studies of depth analysis and the incredible progressions that are made through the combination of usually a course of therapy, of some kind of creative expression in many cases, of parts work, which I think may be able to stand in for the creative stuff, and of course the way in which the relationship of the waking self, you know, we might say the dreamer, or better yet, the dreamer who remembers, has to what the dreams show him about this other side of life. So it's easy to be biased. It's easy to think that, dreams may be interesting, they may be unpleasant. They may be the worst part of a person's day in some cases, in which case please talk to one of us and maybe a doctor. But they're not gonna raise your children. They're not gonna pay your bills. They're less important than everything that happens when we're awake. And maybe that has some validity. I think the generous approach to having conversations about what's important to a person, what's not important to a person. These are sort of dialectical engagements where we can really look at things from a number of different perspectives and then call attention to what may be left out, what makes it a more full picture. Maybe there's some reasons that people like to kind of draw lines around their critical faculties and say, no, let's just not entertain flat earthers, or let's not entertain that dreams have any role in therapy. Let's just some hugaboo from earlier times when people were sort of reaching and trying to make a name for themselves. But what that does is that leaves out all these case studies. It also neglects the mechanisms that, like I say, have been pretty well developed in popular culture, especially with things like the internal family systems. But they could be much more well developed because we have film. Because you don't necessarily have to be in therapy with somebody like me or somebody more into, more pure Jungian dream analysis to really see what your inner world is like. Just like you don't need to go and become a mathematician to understand a little bit about the fabric of reality, quantum physics and things. There are people that find this stuff entirely fascinating and something that we all really ought to learn about if we're interested. In the case of psychology, something that could really change how we face our lives and the possibilities that we hold for ourselves to become free. So I guess that's just a teaser of there is a mechanism, and there are very definitive maturational change points in the course of therapy that involves heavily a conversation with the dreams, which in my opinion is better if there can be someone who understands the language of dreams to really bring them to life. This is not a traditional analytic or humanist approach to dream work. In my opinion, it's better because I've seen results from this, and I've seen some of those other methods miss important details for too long. So at any rate, if we're looking at a situation where there's a trauma, maybe even a dissociated trauma, and let's just say a trauma that happens in childhood where part of the child's experience is so unbearable, does not have a place to be shared by others, and may even contain elements of the complex feelings that come from some childhood traumas that would be very scary and very unpleasant, sort of impossible to imagine sharing with any adult apart from the perpetrators. It could hold space for it and help them find a way to see what needs might be being met in spite of the profound, horrific, traumatic sacrifices that are happening to other aspects of self-experience. When I talk about these aspects of self-experience, I find it very helpful to turn to, to the theory of Patanjali, the Yoga Sutras. It may seem a bit anachronistic or maybe too popular if you think of yoga as this form of exercise where they kind of weave in some pop Hinduism, but really at the root of the Yoga Sutras, we look at the self in terms of these mental activities called vrittis, and especially these 5 mental activities that are tied to what leads to various forms of suffering. And generally, they begin with a loss of a more full awareness. In fact, in this case, awareness that is so full that it's like the blazing light of the sun and the infinite depths of emptiness that characterize life and the measure of mind, the measure of all that in us which sees could take in. It's unimaginable, the extent of the psyche. And so when that's out of the picture, especially when there's not even like a trace of it in the form of, of this a type of way that it usually comes to us, which is like grace or love, or even just this beautiful sound of silence that especially if you spend a good amount of time in real meditation, it can become sort of a part of the background of life that orients you to, I don't know, just something very special that you just sort of know is very special. So when that's not quite as apparent, or for a more relatable example, when you feel like you're in a state of reactivity and the judgment that you might have, the maturity that you might have at your disposal, if you were not being activated in this way, seems missing. That's the first of these. The lack of the wisdom of insight, of a very clear perspective. The next one is a sense of self. We can feel a lot of different ways, and you probably do in different environments. There are also ways that are entrained networks of neuronal firing that somehow give rise to this experience or this experience. They can be formed in these patterns, when we're young, when we're our current age, one in response to another, as if there are these relationships that happen inside. So sometimes when you start to feel there's a grief coming, something in there that still lives in that grief, an experience of self that lives in that grief, that doesn't have the access to the grace of some profoundly ever-present reality that holds space for it. Instead, when that grief comes forward, that one feeling the grief comes forward, I know this is going to sound strange, but there's another experience of self that can notice it, like one note in a song interacting with another note in a song, both at the same time. And that is the experience of, oh God, I don't want to feel that way. Or, oh, I'm angry that I feel that way. Or maybe I've made peace with how thinking about that makes me feel. These are some of the stages of grief, right? Anger, denial, despair, acceptance, bargaining. Different ways that we feel about our experiences of feeling certain ways. This is one example of how there are many of these asmita, these sense of selves that have two of the other vrittis, something that they want, something they need to avoid, kama, dvesha. And then, of course, this intrinsic sense of not wanting to be shut out, to be snuffed out. Like in What Dreams May Come, this place of relegating to the unconscious a whole aspect of our experience. The ways that we might feel that might be awakened in us. There is something very unpleasant about being shut out of consciousness, being shut out from the light of that life that the mind has shining at this level, always. When an experience that's traumatic is exiled because other experiences of self package it in such a way to see it as a perpetrator, to see it as the actual thing that was in our environment at that time, without recognizing that that is an experience of another manifestation of ourselves in the midst of it. And other aspects see that as the event or as the person that either perhaps we are absolutely crushed by, or that maybe another aspect of self is clinging to have some sort of love and attention, or whatever. There's so many of these interrelationships that can happen, and you can see how it's so easy for them to become buried. Now, when that happens, and I like to cross over from IFS to another form of ego state therapy called DNMS, and I may do it a bit too liberally here, but in this case, it's just to borrow the phrase, stuck in the past. So when there are parts that are stuck in the past, and there are parts that are stuck that when they do get activated, it's still in relationship to some of these interior elements of trauma or of being overtaken by something. When a part of self, when there's an experience of being stuck in the trauma, it's almost like one is being inhabited by something predatory. Quick example, somebody who had been subjected to the type of predation that I was kind of hinting at, found one part that actually sought comfort in the company of that other person at the expense of all of these other young versions of self that were caught suspended in a near-death state, suffering immensely. But having this one little kind of haven of kind of a companionship, sort of like in Stranger Things when the kids are in this nice house all together where it seems like they have the companionship of the person who ended up, holding these children to sort of power him to have a greater influence over the collective consciousness of this community. That opens up a whole other topic, of course, of how what we might call the collective unconscious, which I think really deserves a better mechanism than some sort of mystical sense. Well, our unconscious lives, our dream worlds, as vast as they are, they can have relationships as well. And what some of the subjugating behaviors convey to the egos of those who have been brought into this sort of business of the subjugation of the unconscious of others offers some elevated states that they might feel as special. A person might feel this if they commit a terrible crime, or many terrible crimes, in the case of what might be like for people involved in warfare, especially the dirty kind that so often prevails. So, at any rate, on the inside, we have this experience that's actually a bit of an oasis, that one of these asmitas, that one of these ego states, one of these ways that the self could possibly feel itself doesn't have to be one of these children dying, feeling traumatized, and can even have companionship with something that looks like the perpetrator. But if we're able to connect that part with something that offers that same amount of love and companionship, but in a much purer way, especially if there happens to be an active, living, spiritual presence, which there's also a mechanism for that. The good news about depth psychology is even things like grace and the presence of a savior within oneself. These are real events in the dream world. And the dream world is not unreal at all. And I've seen it. And when you watch someone go through the processes of healing, you start to understand things a bit differently, especially if you recognize that this physical universe around us is really just our brain's construction of something that we can make sense of, rather than endless signals and chaos, trillions of neutrinos coursing through our body at every moment. And, all we see is a little visible spectrum. And actually none of it is anything but our mind's representation using this mind stuff. And by stuff, I mean qualitative field of experience. In Yoga Sutras, they call it chitta, and they say it's like a jewel that takes on the shape or the color of whatever it's placed upon. So that chitta, that mind stuff, that representational field, it does give us a fairly concise and useful representation of our world with lots of detail. Better than for many animals, I'm sure. Maybe not as good for some, in some senses. But also, that chitta also interacts with the dream world, and especially when we're dreaming, which is why we say it's the dream world, when there's a conscious experiencer that actually is witness to this whole inner world. And in some dreams, you may be this one, in some dreams, you may be this one. And in the example that I'm using, there's the child in relationship to a perpetrator. But if we look inside of that perpetrator in the child's experience, inside is another child, perhaps trapped in there. And his presence in there gives rise to it seeming that this perpetrator lives on in the child. This is crucial, and it's something that IFS does not cover very well. Apart from ancestral and unattached burdens, generally the living presence of a representation of another in the self is not something IFS handles as well as DNMS, in my opinion. But we have wonderful practitioners that make the most of any system. I like to turn to DNMS for this, where we find within that other the child that's been stuck there, not wanting to be stuck there. And when he comes out, he looks like a small little plaything. And there's this monster, this alien, this thing, which is able to hold him hostage. But with the help and the perspective of that clear light, either through a spiritual guide or ideally with DNMS, with an aspect of self which is forever unconditioned and present and available in the present moment, what the Buddhists call bodhisattvas. But in DNMS, it just looks like the person that you are that comes forth when you're really taking care of somebody, either in a nurturing way or in a skillful, protective way. And with them there, they can assure him that this monster is no more real than an old memory that is alive, that has control over him as long as he fears it. And with that knowledge, and perhaps some other interventions to help show it to him, a bit of a desensitization around the fear, around the seemingly living memory. This is trauma work. It becomes small, and it becomes the toy, the plaything, the thing that can be put in one's pocket, and the child becomes real. And at that moment, the child is able to do just what Robin Williams did in the beginning of What Dreams May Come. Often they show up in our relationships, they show up in our life. There are cues which trigger and elicit the experiences of self held by these parts that are being excavated. And so in the course of trauma work, sometimes it's possible to be quite sensitive to cues and triggers, so one should be careful. But the only reason generally for them breaking through the surface and flooding us with their experience is it's kind of like, I'll turn to Lassie. They're trying to help you find Timmy that's lost in the well. So when they've done that, and when they are in the care and guidance of these aspects of the adult self that have already had experience in other situations of being naturally, effortlessly, and appropriately protective, nurturing, supportive, this relationship gets to live on in the inside. And those parts which blend, those experiences of asmita, kama, dvesha, abhinivesha, the fear of being made into non-existence, all underneath this, the vidya, this lack of awareness of greater beauty of this moment. Those ways of needing to cling on to life can be relaxed, and there's an internal loving relationship in the internal realm, the realm of dreams, from where dreams may come. They get to go fly around, and if they want to go to a place that made them feel comfortable, if they want an animal to be present, maybe a milkshake, it's all there. And so I just really wanted to make the connection to this film. It's not death, although I don't know what happens to consciousness when one dies. I imagine people have probably gone through stages of death and the activation of all this life that I'm calling the sort of the dream world. Sort of at night when the sun goes down, we see so many stars. And if we have telescopes or arrays, gosh, we can see whole galaxies, other people's stars perhaps. It's like that maybe. I don't know. Our right hemisphere also processes things in a quite a different symbolic way. And a lot of this beauty is when we learn to listen to the way that it actually shows us our reality. Even though it shows us the things we see around us and it puts it into context for us, left hemisphere doesn't really get a lot of things done by reflecting on that so much, unless you have my job. Or maybe you're a screenwriter or something, or a poet. It's actually quite good that we have some sense of balance. And this is one of the dialectics of this internal work. I'll often turn parts work into just talking about you and the way that you feel about you feeling when you feel this way. And it's just kind of helpful and validating to see that it makes sense in that way as well. But to really capture it and to really see the possibilities of experiences of self that are caught in certain ways that really don't feel ready to be living an adult life. They really shouldn't be expected to. Well, they have this whole world inside. Once they're freed from these ways of being bound, once Robin Williams goes down to the lowest level of hell and decides he wants to be there with the one who became lost, which is a beautiful image. Probably also, could be another video essay about dynamics in intimate relationships with regard to characterological compromise and mental health. But I digress. With regard to this Castor and Pollux situation where a twin brother goes into Hades so that the other brother may come forward and live in the light. Well, this is maybe even better than that. And then, of course, what happens with the toy figurine, this former alien monster that could come in and consume a child, so that what lives inside is the monster that did this to him, that left him with this dilemma of feeling loved, surrounded by a forest of his own dying corpses, having been pummeled and traumatized, so that one part of self can experience love and intimacy with an internalization of somebody that was probably doing something on the outside to escape from his own forest of death. Although, of course, these acts should never be perpetrated, but they are perpetrated out of the same internal dynamics of escape, and in some cases of power that I've alluded to so far. But what happens with what's left over from it? Well, this is where DNMS offers the building of a relationship and the processing of pain, anger, grief, and all kinds of emotions, and the real development of an experience of all these partial experiences that did not get what they needed in terms of protection, guidance, love, recognition, from the unconditioned, eternally grounded and centered adult self, which is often inhibited by the mind trying to do therapy rather than recognizing that it's almost a sort of grace is there from the self that's not stuck in having to try to fix something, which usually entails more dissociation. When the right approach is taken, accessing these beautiful resources of our human nature and building a relationship with those aspects which still carry the remnants of what had happened to them, then they can begin to heal, and ultimately those remnants actually disappear, or whatever feels right. They often don't want to necessarily carry them around once it's clear that they've been freed, just like in that film. And who knows, maybe in some ways, the end scene of that film where there's two new children, maybe that represents the life of the child living within. Maybe it represents the relationship of love that then can become available to disclose the life of an actual child of the individual who's been through this type of healing. There's so many possibilities, and it's so beautiful. And we shouldn't consign dreams and art to something that's just less than what this life is made of. I wouldn't give away the grounding of having a place and a body and a home and sufficient resources for food and maybe even cultivation of health and friendship. But people that have all that have parts lost deep down inside, well, that's another kind of poverty. And so we should honor both, as well as the vastness and the brightness we learn to rely on in this kind of work. So it was a bit of a meandering discussion, and thank you for your patience. I wish you the very most in your own journey.